Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to getting smart fast. We dig through the sources so you don't have to. Today, we're tackling a real literary curiosity. It's a story that basically invented the detective genre as we know it, but here's the twist. Its own creator, the Edgar Allan Poe, kind of fumbled the ending in real life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We're looking to see Auguste Dupin, Poe's brilliant armchair detective, specifically his second case, The Mystery of Marie Rogêt. And what makes this deep dive special is that Poe wasn't just making things up. He was doing something incredibly bold, taking a real sensational unsolved murder from New York, the Mary Rogers case.
Right, the beautiful cigar girl.
Exactly. And he tried to solve it using nothing but fictional logic, what he called ratiocination. He transplanted the whole thing to Paris, called her Marie Rogêt, and set Dupin loose on the facts.
So that's our mission today. We're going to dissect Poe's method, this ratiocination thing. We'll see how he used Marie Rogêt in Paris as a sort of proxy for Mary Rogers in New York. But the big question is, did his perfect logic actually stand up when the messy truth of the real crime came out?
And to really put it under the microscope, we're going to use a framework that came much later. We'll measure Poe's story against S.S. Van Dien's famous 20 rules for writing detective stories.
Mm-hmm.
These rules basically lay out the contract between the writer and the reader for a fair play mystery. And, well, Poe, the guy who started it all, actually breaks some key ones here.
That's great. Judging the inventor by the specs of a modern machine. Okay, this sounds good. Let's start where it all began. The real-life tragedy that grabbed headlines and inspired Poe, the case of Mary Rogers.
Okay, so Mary Cecilia Rogers, born 1820, her life started out pretty ordinary. Her father died young, and her mom ran a boarding house there on Nassau Street in New York. But things really changed for her around age 20.
And it sounds like it changed almost entirely because of how she looked, right? The sources really stress her appearance. She gets this job as a clerk, a cigar girl, at John Anderson's shop on Broadway near Thomas Street. This was early 1840. But it wasn't really about selling cigars?
No, not at all. She was hired basically as an attraction. The descriptions are just glowing: marvelous beauty, brunette, symmetrical form, jet black hair, classic 19th century descriptions. She very quickly became, well, famous in her own small way, sort of like an early local celebrity or, I guess, an influencer today. The shop itself was a known spot.
And it wasn't just regular folks coming in. The sources mentioned big names: James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving. They were customers. So this wasn't just a shop girl job. It made her a public figure, someone people talked about, someone they went to see. Generated a lot of buzz for the store, too, I bet.
Definitely. And all this public attention really set the stage for what happened next. It started with, let's call it a dry run. She just vanished. This was late January 1841, about 10 months after she started at Anderson's.
And the newspapers went wild, right? Her first disappearance got huge coverage. She came back 6 days later, said she was just visiting relatives out in the country. Kind of a boring explanation.
Totally mundane. But the public, already hooked on her story, they preferred the juicier rumors.
Yeah, the big one was that she'd run off, eloped, with a tall, handsome naval officer.
Right. And even though that story wasn't true at the time, remember that detail, the naval officer? It becomes really important later in Poe's analysis, in Dupin's thinking. It planted an idea.
Okay, so after that first scare, maybe she got tired of the spotlight or the gossip. She quit the cigar store job, went back to her mom's boarding house. She was engaged then, right? To a guy named Daniel Payne, a clerk who boarded there. Things seemed quieter.
For a while. Until July 1841, the real tragedy. On Sunday, July 25th, Mary tells her fiancé, Daniel Payne, she's going to visit her aunt on Bleecker Street. Said, "I'll call for you tonight." Payne was out for the day himself. That evening, there was a massive thunderstorm. Payne figured, sensibly she'd just stay overnight at her aunt's place because of the storm. So he didn't go to meet her.
Wow. Just a simple assumption based on the weather. But she never actually made it to the aunt's house. 3 days go by. Then, July 28th, her body is found, floating in the Hudson River over near Hoboken, New Jersey. Elysian Fields.
And the reaction in New York was just explosive. Instantly, her youth, her beauty, her sort of micro-celebrity status, it was the perfect storm for the media. The sources are clear. The police were baffled, and the city was gripped by intense excitement. It drowned out everything else.
Became the only story in town. People forgot about politics, business, whatever else was happening. For weeks, apparently, it was just all anyone could talk about.
Yeah, the police were completely under the gun. They put up a reward. Poe uses 1,000 francs in his story. But the real reward got huge. With contributions from a citizens' committee, it eventually hit 30,000 francs, which was an absolutely massive amount of money back then. especially for finding the killer of a working-class girl. Shows you how desperate the city was for answers, for some kind of resolution.
And even with that huge reward and all the public pressure, the police arrested a few people, but nothing stuck. They just couldn't crack it. The real case of Mary Rogers remained unsolved, a genuine mystery. And that's the void Edgar Allan Poe decided he, or rather Dupin, could fill with pure logic.
Right. This is where Poe steps in. He wasn't just reading the news anymore. He decided to sort of intervene. He'd probably seen calls in the papers for a more logical analysis of all the confusing facts. And apparently he actually knew Mary Rogers slightly as a customer at the cigar store.
Okay, but hold on. Isn't that incredibly, well, arrogant? He's basically sitting there in Philadelphia telling the entire New York City police force, you guys are missing something obvious. I can solve this with my brain using my fictional detective.
Oh, it was definitely intellectual hubris, no question. But kind of brilliant hubris, too. His plan, his design, as he called it, was totally new. He'd used Dupin to do this long and rigorous analysis of the real New York tragedy, just under the guise of solving the fictional Paris case of Marie Rogêt. His goal was to show that ratiocination, this careful, step-by-step reasoning, could cut through all the noise, the bad leads, the public hysteria.
He really thought he'd nailed it, didn't he? Believed he'd figured out who the killer was, or at least the type of killer, and proved that the popular theory, the gang of ruffians idea, was just plain wrong. He had his perfect logical ending all mapped out.
He did. He wrote the story in installments. It started getting published in 1842. He had his neat conclusion ready to go, pointing the thinker logically at one specific person. But then, reality threw a massive wrench in the works. Real life rarely follows a neat plotline.
Right, the publication of the final part got delayed, and it wasn't a printing problem, was it? It was because something happened in the real case.
Exactly. A deathbed confession. It came from a woman named Mrs. Loss. She sometimes went by Killenbrook. She ran a roadside inn, kind of a tavern, near Weehawken, New Jersey, close to where Mary's body was actually found. As she was dying, she confessed everything to a Justice Merritt.
And the confession itself, well, from a storytelling perspective, it was almost disappointingly mundane, wasn't it? No complex plot, no mastermind.
Totally. Mrs. Loss said Mary Rogers hadn't been attacked by a gang or killed by a spurned lover. She'd come to the inn with a young physician. They were there for an illegal abortion, a premature delivery. Something went terribly wrong during the procedure, and Mary died. Right there at the end.
Oh, wow. So an accident. A
No.
tragic, illegal, hidden accident.
Yes. And then Mrs. Loss's son panicked. He took Mary's body, disposed it in the river, and then deliberately scattered her clothes in the woods nearby. The stuff found in the thicket to make it look like a violent assault to throw the police off track.
That just completely demolishes Poe's carefully constructed logic, doesn't it? He spent the whole story building a case for a premeditated murder by a specific type of killer.
Shattered it. The reality was accidental death, a cover-up born of panic and desperation. It made Poe's elaborate deductions about the killer's identity and methods, well, wrong, factually incorrect based on the real events.
So he had to hit pause on publishing the ending, delay it, and then what? He had to adjust the text, as the sources say.
This is maybe the most intriguing part. Poe's scramble to save face, to protect his image as this master reasoner. When the story was reprinted later, in 1845, he went back and tweaked things. Added little bits, deleted others, subtly trying to shift the narrative so it looked like he'd sort of hinted at the abortion possibility all along. He even added footnotes, trying to make it seem like his analysis still held up, or that Dupin somehow foresaw this outcome, even though Dupin's main conclusion points elsewhere entirely.
So he kind of cheated his own system. He bent his pure logic to fit the inconvenient facts that emerged later. It really shows the limits of trying to impose a perfect, rational structure onto the messiness of real life, real secrets, real accidents.
That's the big takeaway, I think. Even though the ending got compromised by reality, the story itself was groundbreaking. It really launched the whole ripped from the headlines genre. It proved people were hungry for this kind of analytical take on real events, even if the analysis wasn't perfect in the end.
And Poe definitely learned from it. If you want ratiocination to work flawlessly, you need a controlled environment. Which is probably why his next and final Dupin story, The Purloined Letter, is purely fictional. No unpredictable real-world events crashing the party. He kept it all in-house, so to speak. Okay, so Poe lays this foundation with Dupin and this idea of ratiocination solving crimes purely through logic and reason. He saw reality itself as a kind of mental process.
Exactly, and that intellectual approach to crime eventually got formalized, almost like a scientific method for mystery writers. Decades later, in 1928, this guy S.S. Van Dyne, that was a pseudonym for Willard Huntington Wright, an art critic and novelist, he laid out these principles. They weren't just suggestions. They were his famous 20 rules for writing detective stories, meant to guarantee, as he put it, a purely intellectual experience for the reader. It's like the official rule book for the genre.
The reader's contract, basically. It defines the game. What are the key parts of this contract? What did Van Dyne think was essential for fair play?
Well, Rule 1 is the absolute bedrock.
Yeah.
The reader must have equal opportunity with the detective for solving the mystery.
Yeah.
All the clues have to be plainly stated and described. It's not just being nice. It makes it a fair contest of wits between the reader and the detective, mediated by the author.
So, no hidden clues. If Dupin finds a weird knot, the author has to tell us about the knot, not just say he found a clue. Otherwise, the detective just looks magically brilliant at the end.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Rule 2 reinforces that. It says, essentially, no cheating by the author. No willful tricks or deceptions may be played on the reader other than those played legitimately by the criminal on the detective himself. The criminal can try to fool the detective, and by extension the reader, but the author can't just hide vital information unfairly.
Okay, fair enough. And Rule 15 seems to put some pressure back on the reader, too. It says the truth should always be apparent if you're smart enough. Rereading the story should make you slap your forehead and say, of course, it was right there. Van Dyne called that the zest of the game. If you miss it, it's on you, not the author pulling a fast one.
Right. These rules really elevate the detective story. It's not just an adventure. It's an intellectual puzzle with strict parameters. The author is managing this intricate little game.
Then there are rules about the detective and the methods used. These kind of set the boundaries of the puzzle itself, like Rule 9, which says there should only be one main detective, like Dupin, why just one?
Van Dyne thought it was crucial for maintaining that direct thread of logic. Multiple detectives, he argued, would just scatter the reader's focus, break the clear line of reasoning. You need to follow one central mind, the ratiocinnator, as they navigate the puzzle. It keeps the focus squarely on the analysis, not on, say, police teamwork or bureaucratic procedures.
And that ties into Rule 8, right, the one that demands a solution comes through strictly naturalistic means. This feels like a direct response to some of Poe's other spookier tendencies.
Absolutely. Rule 8 is a total ban on anything supernatural or occult being the method of solution. No Ouija boards, mind reading, spiritualistic seances, crystal gazing. The second you bring in ghosts or magic, the logical contract is broken. The reader can't compete with otherworldly information.
So the detective has to solve it using evidence anyone could theoretically observe and analyze. No psychic shortcuts.
And Rule 14 tightens that even more, focusing on the kind of evidence. Methods have to be rational, scientific, no pseudoscience. The murder weapon can't be some super rare, undiscovered poison from a remote jungle that only the author knows about. You have to stick to the known science of the day, the pharmacopoeia for poisons, for example. The solution needs to be grounded in reality.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the rules for the crime itself and the killer, because these are the ones where Poe's Marie Rogêt, tangled up with the real Mary Rogers case, really trips up. Rule 7 and Rule 810 seem critical here. Rule 7, there simply must be a corpse, and the deader the corpse, the better.
And Rule 18 is the killer punchline for Poe. The crime must never turn out to be an accident or a suicide. Van Dyne calls that an unpardonable trick. The whole point of the intellectual game is figuring out who had the motive and means for murder. If it was just an accident, well, the reader feels cheated. All that deduction becomes pointless.
Which is exactly what happened with Mary Rogers. The confession revealed it was an accidental death from a botched abortion. So Poe's story, by trying to solve the real case, was basically doomed by reality to break this core rule of the genre he helped create.
Precisely. And then there's Rule 17, which is just wonderfully cynical about human nature. It says a professional criminal should never be the culprit.
Why not? Seems like they'd be good suspects.
Because, Van Dyne argues, the real fascination isn't catching a known gangster. The thrill is in unmasking the hypocrite. The truly fascinating crime, he says, is the one committed by the pillar of the church, or a spinster noted for her charities. It's about revealing the darkness hidden beneath respectability.
Ah, the shock value of social exposure.
Exactly. And Rule 10 makes sure that respectable killer is actually in the story. The culprit has to be someone who played a more or less prominent part. You can't just pull a stranger out of a hat in the last chapter. That's lazy writing. That the killer has to have been there all along, hiding in plain sight for the reader to potentially spot.
So these rules paint a picture of classic detective fiction as this very controlled, very artificial game. It's about intellectual fairness and exposing secrets within a closed system. A system Poe invented, but one he couldn't quite maintain when faced with the chaos of a real, unsolved tragedy. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's actually watch Dupin put this ratiocination into action in Marie Rogêt. Remind us again, what's the core idea?
It's all about focusing on the tiny overlooked details, the collateral evidence, as Dupin calls it, applying cold, hard logic to the things the police, caught up in the big picture or common assumptions, just completely miss.
And Dupin actually says Marie Rogêt is harder because it seems like a common crime, right? Unlike the bizarre ape killing and murders in the Rue Morgue.
Exactly. He points out that the very ordinariness of Marie's murder is what stumps the police. It seems like it could have been anyone, done in any number of ways. They're discouraged and confounded by the lack of obvious weird clues. But Dupin, the true reasoner, knows that even in an ordinary crime, there will be unusual details if you look closely enough.
So where does he start? He first tackles the identity question, doesn't he? There was a newspaper, L'Etoile, suggesting the body wasn't even Marie's.
Right. L'Etoile floated this idea that maybe Marie had run off again, perhaps something about her chastity, and the family was covering it up. Their main proof was the timing of the body surfacing. They claimed a drowned body needs 6 to 10 days of decomposition before it floats. Since this body was found in only 3 days, they argued it couldn't be someone who drowned on the day Marie disappeared.
Sounds logical on the surface. How does Dupin pick that apart?
With science. The rationale of the rule, he calls it. He talks about specific gravity. The human body is only a tiny bit denser than fresh water, and women's bodies, often having more fat and smaller bones, can be even lighter. Some might barely sink at all.
But the key thing wasn't just density, was it? It was how the person entered the water.
That's the ratiocination masterstroke. Dupin distinguishes between someone who actively drowns versus a body thrown in after death. If you drown, you struggle, you flail, you raise your arms, you gasp and inhale water into your lungs and stomach. All that makes the body significantly heavier, denser. So it sinks.
Okay, makes sense.
But Dupin argues a body thrown into the water immediately after death by violence doesn't struggle, doesn't inhale water, it's dead weight. And generally, he says, that body would not sink at all, or at least not deeply.
So the fact the body was found floating after only 3 days doesn't mean it wasn't Marie. It actually suggests she was killed first, then put in the river. He completely flips their logic using basic physics. It's evidence for murder, not against identity.
Exactly. Pure deductive brilliance from a simple observation about buoyancy. Once he's settled the identity, Dupin goes after the main police theory, the gang of ruffians. This theory was almost entirely based on the stuff found in that thicket near the river. Marie's clothes, parasol, handkerchief, all neatly arranged. The police saw it as the crime scene. Dupin sees it as staged.
How does he dismantle that? He starts with the timeline again, right? Based on mildew and grass?
Yeah, another newspaper, Le Soleil, claimed the items must have been there for 3 or 4 weeks because there was mildew on them and the grass had grown up around them. Dupin just demolishes this with, again, basic knowledge. He points out that mildew is a fungus. In damp conditions, it can appear and disappear literally within 24 hours. It proves nothing about weeks.
And the grass.
Same thing. He says in warm, damp weather, grass can shoot up 2 or 3 inches in a single day, easily enough to partially hide things within a week, maybe less. So the police timeline of weeks is just guesswork, lazy observation. The items could have been planted there much, much more recently.
Then he looks at how the clothes were arranged. That seemed off to him, too.
Totally. They were laid out so neatly on stones, petticoat here, scarf there, like they were placed as if upon shelves. Dupin argues a real violent struggle involving multiple attackers, the kind that would trample the ground, as the police noted, would never leave clothes arranged so artificially. It would be chaos.
And the tears in the fabric. The police thought thorns did it.
Right. But Dupin gets into the physics of tearing fabric. To rip a piece clean off a garment, he says, usually requires 2 opposing forces. It's very unlikely a single thorn could do that cleanly. His conclusion, the pieces were torn off purposely and by hand.
Yeah.
More evidence of staging, someone trying to simulate violence but doing it clumsily.
But Dupin's biggest argument against the gang theory, the one he calls irresistible, isn't about the physical evidence at all, is it? It's psychological, or maybe economic.
It's pure human nature, backed by economics. He asks the killer question. With that huge reward out there, 30,000 francs and a full pardon offered for any accomplice who turns state's evidence, why has nobody talked?
Ah, the prisoner's dilemma writ large.
Pretty much. Dupin argues that a gang of ruffians, likely low-class criminals, are typically disloyal, self-interested, and motivated by money and saving their own skin. The odds that every single member of a gang would stay silent when offered a fortune and freedom. Astronomical.
Yeah.
It's just not believable. Someone would have cracked.
So the very fact that the secret hasn't come out.
Is the very best of proof that it is, in fact, a secret known only to one person, or maybe two at the absolute most. That deduction alone completely shifts the investigation. Forget the mob. We're looking for a lone killer.
Okay, so he's cleared the decks, ruled out the gang, confirmed the identity. Now, how does he build the case against this solitary killer? He goes back to the tiny details.
Back to the knots in the body. He looks at the muslin strip found tied around Marie's neck. It is secured with a very specific hard knot, what he identifies as a slip or sailor's knot. Ding, ding, ding. That points directly to someone with a nautical background. A sailor, or perhaps a naval officer.
The knot is the clue. And Dupin even figures out why the knot was used, right? Not just for strangling.
Yeah, he thinks it wasn't primarily to silence her. A handkerchief stuffed in the mouth would be better for that. He deduces it was used as a kind of handle or harness. The killer probably tried carrying the body first, maybe using a piece of clothing tied around the waist, but found the dead weight too much. So he added the neck strip to drag the body the rest of the way to the river.
Gruesome, but logical. And that dragging ties into marks on the body.
Yes, Dupin connects peculiar marks on the victim's back and shoulders, which the police likely overlooked or misinterpreted, to the bottom ribs of a boat, suggesting the body was dragged into or over a small boat before being dumped in the river.
And all this marine stuff, the knot, the boat dragging, suddenly makes that old rumor from her first disappearance seem relevant again. The tall, handsome naval officer.
Exactly. Dupin connects the dots. The dark-complexioned man seen with Marie shortly before her final disappearance, testified to by witnesses like Madame Deluc and an omnibus driver named Valance. Maybe that was the naval officer from the rumor. The initial dismissed gossip suddenly looks like a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, not dragging, naval officer connection. What's the final piece? The boat itself?
The rudderless boat. It's another one of those small details buried in the newspaper reports that Dupin seizes on. An empty sailboat was found floating adrift near the scene. It got towed to the local barge office. Later, the owner came and claimed it. But here's the crucial part. He took the boat without asking for the rudder, which had apparently come off or been removed.
Why is the rudder detail so important?
Think about it. The killer, our naval officer, needed to dispose of the body. He likely used his own small boat. Afterwards, wanting to ditch the evidence, he just casts the boat adrift. Doesn't have time to secure it properly. Maybe the rudder comes loose. Later, he hears his boat has been found and taken to the barge office, a place he probably knows well. He has to retrieve it, but he can't ask about the rudder. Why?
Because asking about a specific missing part, the rudder, would immediately link him to the boat at the time it was found adrift near the crime scene. It would draw suspicion.
Precisely. Taking the boat without mentioning the rudder is suspicious in its own way, but less immediately damning than asking for the missing piece. It suggests someone trying to quietly remove evidence, someone with a personal, permanent connection to the Navy or Marine activities, as Dupin puts it.
So Dupin ties it all together. The sailor's knot, the dragging mark suggesting a boat, the connection to the naval officer rumor, and the suspicious behavior around the rudderless boat. It all points to one person. And his final proposed step fits Van Dien's Rule 1 perfectly using available evidence.
Yes. He suggests comparing the handwriting, the MS or manuscript, of the naval officer suspected from the first disappearance with the anonymous letters that were sent to the newspapers trying to blame the crime on a gang. Dupin is confident that handwriting analysis will provide the result desired, confirming the officer wrote the misleading letters to cover his tracks. It's a beautiful chain of logic, built entirely on overlooked details. #Chag outro. So when we step back and look at this whole deep dive into Marie Rogêt, what's the bottom line? We have this brilliant display of logic, this ratiocination, but it ultimately pointed to a conclusion that a naval officer killer that was, well, contradicted by the real-life confession about the abortion.
Right. It means Poe's specific solution was wrong, in fact. But you could argue Dupin's method was still a triumph, couldn't you? His logic successfully cut through all the noise, the bad police work, the media frenzy. It demolished the bogus gang theory and correctly identified that the evidence pointed to a single, intelligent individual staging the scene. Ratiocination worked, even if the ultimate cause of death was different than deduced.
I think that's fair. And the deeper philosophical point Poe was making through Dupin is really about where truth comes from. Dupin keeps stressing that the important stuff, the larger portion of all truth, often springs from the collateral, the side details, the accidents, the things nobody else thinks matter.
Like the knots, the mildew, the rudder. The truth isn't always in the main event, it's hiding in the margins. Dupin says science needs to learn how to calculate upon the unforeseen. Basically, turn chance itself into something you can analyze logically.
Yeah, making chance a matter of absolute calculation. It requires a different way of thinking. Not just looking at the obvious facts, but weighing the probabilities hidden in those seemingly random details. And to leave you with something to chew on, Dupin brings up that classic example from the calculus of probabilities.
Ah, the dice throwing thing. It's hard to convince someone that if you throw double sixes twice, the odds of throwing it a third time haven't changed, right?
Exactly. Most people's intuition screams otherwise. Those first two throws feel like they must influence the next one. They're absolutely in the past, Dupin says, but our gut tells us the dice are somehow due for a change.
But the purely logical mathematical mind, the raciocinators, knows the probability for each independent throw remains the same, 1 in 36. The past doesn't actually change the future odds in that scenario. Dupin uses this to show how easily our reasoning gets flawed when we focus too much on the immediate details, the apparent patterns, or our gut feelings, and ignore the underlying mathematical reality or the broader context. Like the police seeing only gang violence instead of the improbability of gang secrecy.
So here's the thought to take away. In your own life, when you're facing a problem or making a decision, how much are you relying on just the main story, the obvious details, your intuition? And how much might you be overlooking the collateral evidence, the subtle probabilities? When might your gut feeling be rejecting the cold, hard math simply because the past feels like it should dictate the future? It's something to think about.